I knew something inside me had broken the moment my own family erased me with a single decision, as if my presence had never mattered. There was no argument, no warning, just the quiet certainty that I had been reduced to an inconvenience in a life I once held together. That was when I realized the deepest betrayals are not loud. They arrive calmly, wrapped in familiarity, and leave scars that do not fade quickly. What followed was not revenge, not anger, but a choice that changed everything and forced them to face a truth they never expected. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Wilson. I am 66 years old, a widow, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, in the United States of America. For most of my life, I believed I understood what stability meant. It meant routine. It meant responsibility. It meant being the person everyone could rely on without ever needing to ask. I did not question that belief for decades because it had carried me through marriage, motherhood, and grief. Only much later did I realize that the same belief was quietly erasing me. The house where I lived was not just a building. It was a 2-story suburban home my husband and I bought more than 40 years ago when Ethan was still a toddler and money was tight, but hope was abundant. Every room carried memory. The kitchen still held the smell of Sunday dinners. The hallway walls once displayed school photos, holiday cards, and proof of a life carefully built. When my husband passed away, that house became my anchor. It was the one place where I still felt whole. For a short while, I lived there alone. Then my son Ethan and his wife Lauren came to me with a plan. They needed a place to stay while they got back on their feet. I said yes without hesitation. I told myself that families stayed together, especially after loss. I told myself that my home was big enough, that my time was flexible, that helping my only child was not a sacrifice but a privilege. At first, everything felt temporary. Boxes stayed unpacked, furniture was rearranged for now. Then slowly, without discussion or ceremony, permanence settled in. Ethan and Lauren moved into the main bedroom. I relocated to a smaller room down the hall. I did not argue. I told myself it was logical. They were younger. They needed space. I was just one person. Days began to follow a pattern. I woke up early, prepared breakfast, and made sure the house was in order before anyone else started their day. I cooked meals, cleaned, and adjusted my schedule around theirs. When grandchildren arrived, my role expanded naturally, or so it seemed. I became the one who watched the clock, the one who remembered appointments, the one who filled in the gaps without being asked. Ethan owned a small business, and numbers had always been my strength. I had worked as an accountant for years before retiring. When he mentioned needing help with bookkeeping, I stepped in without thinking. I reviewed expenses, organized invoices, and kept records balanced. I never asked for payment. I never considered it work. It was simply what mothers did. Over time, my days stopped belonging to me. I measured them by other people's needs. I stopped noticing when decisions were made without my input or when my opinions were politely ignored. I convinced myself that this was maturity, that wanting less was wisdom. I repeated the same quiet promise to myself again and again. As long as the family is fine, I am fine. But somewhere beneath that promise, something shifted. I noticed that conversations happened around me instead of with me. Plans were announced rather than discussed. I was always informed, never consulted. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked if I needed space. I was simply there, dependable and silent, like a piece of furniture that had always been part of the room. I still believed I mattered. I believed I was needed. What I did not yet understand was how easily being needed could turn into being taken for granted, and how quietly a woman could disappear while remaining physically present in her own home. If you're still watching and this beginning already feels uncomfortably familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what happens next is the moment everything starts to quietly unravel. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Christmas Eve had always followed a rhythm I knew by heart. Even before anyone else woke up, I would already be in the kitchen, moving quietly, careful not to wake the house. Outside, the neighborhood in Columbus glowed with soft lights. Wreaths hung on doors, and inflatable snowmen leaned slightly in the cold, as if tired from holding their smiles all month. It was the same every year, and that familiarity used to comfort me. I had planned the holiday meal days in advance. The grocery list sat neatly folded on the counter, checked and rechecked. The turkey was already thawing. The pie dough rested in the refrigerator, wrapped carefully, waiting for the morning. I cleaned the house the way I always did, paying attention to corners no one else noticed, because order had always been my way of showing care. No one asked me to do these things. They never had. I simply did them, because that was who I was in this family. That morning, my phone vibrated while I stood at the sink rinsing vegetables. I wiped my hands on a towel before picking it up, expecting something routine, perhaps a reminder or a question about dinner timing. Instead, I read a short message from Ethan telling me that Christmas dinner was canceled and that they would be spending the day with Lauren's parents instead. The words were simple, efficient, and strangely final. There was no apology, no suggestion of an alternative, no acknowledgement of what the day meant to me. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the screen as if it might explain itself. It did not. I did not cry. I did not feel angry right away. What settled over me was something quieter, heavier, a hollow feeling that spread slowly through my chest. I placed the phone face down on the counter and looked around the kitchen, at the ingredients laid out, at the table I had already set with care. For the first time, it occurred to me that no one had asked what my plans were. There was no question about whether I would join them, no pause to consider how I might spend the day. I had not been excluded deliberately, perhaps, but I had also not been included at all. I had simply been removed from the equation. I tried to excuse it. I told myself they were busy, that Lauren's parents lived farther away, that this was just one holiday. I reminded myself that families change, that children grow up and traditions shift. Still, something felt different this time. This was not a negotiation or a misunderstanding. It was a decision made without me, communicated as an afterthought. As the morning passed, I continued moving through the house, but everything felt slightly off. The familiar tasks no longer grounded me. The counters were clean, the decorations still hung, but the purpose behind them had disappeared. I imagined the house later that evening, quiet and empty, while laughter filled another home somewhere else. The image lingered longer than I expected. I thought back to past Christmases, to years when I had orchestrated everything, when my role was obvious and unquestioned. I remembered being tired but fulfilled, knowing I was the one holding the pieces together. Now, I wondered when that role had become optional, when my presence had shifted from essential to convenient. A question formed in my mind, one I had never allowed myself to ask before. If I were not here, would anything change? Would anyone notice the absence, or only the inconvenience it caused? The thought unsettled me, not because it hurt, but because it made too much sense. By the end of the day, Christmas no longer felt canceled. It felt revealed. Something about my place in this family had been quietly stripped of its meaning, and I could not unsee it. I did not act on that realization yet. I simply carried it with me, knowing that once a truth is recognized, it cannot be returned to where it came from. If you're still here and starting to sense how small decisions can become dangerous turning points, comment number 2 below. What happens next is the first sign that this was never just a misunderstanding. Now let's move on to chapter 3. After Christmas passed, the house returned to its usual rhythm, but something in me had shifted. I moved through the days as I always had, yet everything felt slightly out of focus, as if I were seeing my own life through a pane of glass. I began to notice details I had ignored before, moments I had dismissed as trivial. The message that canceled Christmas did not create this awareness, but it unlocked it. Once opened, it refused to close. I started looking backward, tracing the quiet changes that had led us here. When Ethan and Lauren first moved in, it was framed as temporary. A few months, maybe less. Boxes stayed in the hallway, and nothing felt permanent. Then one evening, they mentioned that the main bedroom made more sense for them. They were a couple, they said, and it had more space. I remember nodding, already rehearsing the reasons it was reasonable. I moved my things into the smaller room down the hall without complaint. It felt like generosity at the time. Only later did I understand it was the first thing I gave up without being asked twice. From there, decisions happened quickly and quietly. My car, which had always been mine, became Ethan's by default. At first, he asked to borrow it for work. Then the keys stopped returning to their hook. I adapted my schedule around that loss, telling myself I did not go out much anyway. Each adjustment felt minor on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I had refused to name. The changes reached deeper when money entered the picture. I had agreed to help Ethan with bookkeeping for his company because I trusted him and because numbers had always made sense to me. I reviewed statements, tracked expenses, and organized records from the dining room table. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I noticed a bank envelope addressed to me that I did not remember expecting. Inside was a notice referencing a loan connected to Ethan's business. The amount was not small. I stood there reading it twice, then a third time waiting for recognition to arrive. It did not. I had no memory of signing anything like that. At first, I assumed I had forgotten. That seemed more plausible than betrayal. I sat down and went through old files, checking dates, reviewing documents I had kept meticulously for years. When I found the loan paperwork, my stomach tightened. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but it was not. The curves were wrong. The pressure was uneven. I knew my own hand after decades of signing my name. I felt embarrassed before I felt afraid. I wondered if age had finally caught up with me, if doubt had replaced certainty without my noticing. I questioned myself instead of the situation, because questioning my son felt unthinkable. When I finally asked Ethan about it, I kept my tone calm, almost apologetic. He brushed it off quickly, telling me not to worry and assuring me everything was under control. His confidence ended the conversation before it began. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to fold the concern away like everything else. But once the idea took root, it grew. I started noticing how often plans were announced instead of discussed, how financial decisions appeared fully formed. I realized that my role had quietly changed from participant to resource, from decision maker to safety net. What unsettled me most was not the money itself, it was the ease with which the line had been crossed. No one had asked if I was comfortable. No one had considered my consent essential. The realization landed slowly but firmly. Something important had been taken from me, and it was not a room or a car or a signature on a page. It was control. That was the first time I understood that this was no longer about helping my family. It was about boundaries that had dissolved without acknowledgement. I did not confront anyone further that day. I simply sat alone in my room, holding the papers in my hands, feeling the weight of a truth I could no longer ignore. Once trust begins to fracture, it makes a sound only the person losing it can hear. If you're still watching and you felt that shift when control began slipping away, comment number 3 below. Because in the next chapter, silence becomes a weapon, and it changes everything. Let's move on to chapter 4. After I realized something was wrong, I did not confront it the way people imagine confrontation should happen. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no dramatic demand for answers. Instead, I tried to speak the way I had learned to speak over the years, carefully, softly, in a tone designed not to upset anyone. I told myself that if I approached it calmly, I would be heard. I believed that reason and restraint would protect the relationship. I waited for a moment when Ethan was not distracted, when the house was quiet and nothing urgent demanded his attention. I chose my words with care, framing my concern as confusion rather than suspicion. I mentioned the bank paperwork and asked if he could help me understand it. I did not accuse him of anything. I did not even say I was worried. I simply asked. The response was immediate and dismissive. He spoke as if I were asking about something trivial, something beyond my grasp. He explained that business paperwork was complicated, that things moved quickly, that I should not stress myself over details I did not need to manage anymore. The conversation ended before it truly began. My question was not answered, but it was neutralized. Lauren entered the room shortly after, and the atmosphere shifted further. She reacted emotionally, as if my confusion were an attack. Her discomfort filled the space, and suddenly I found myself apologizing for raising the issue at all. The focus moved away from the documents and onto her feelings, and once again I stepped back, telling myself it was not worth upsetting the household. That pattern repeated itself in small, subtle ways. Each time I tried to express uncertainty or ask for clarity, the response grew sharper. I began to sense that my role in these conversations was not to participate, but to retreat. Silence, I learned, was what restored balance. Silence allowed life to continue smoothly for everyone else. I started noticing how often my schedule was assumed rather than discussed. Meals were planned around my availability without asking if I wanted to be available. Errands were added to my day without consultation. My time was treated as flexible because it belonged to no one else. I had become a constant, and constants are rarely questioned. The most unsettling part was how quickly I began to doubt myself. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I had sounded accusatory, if my concern had been unnecessary. I worried about being labeled difficult or dramatic. I feared becoming the kind of older woman people quietly avoid. That fear kept me quiet more effectively than any argument ever could. But something inside me was changing. I began to see that my silence was not preserving peace. It was preserving convenience. The harmony I thought I was protecting was one-sided, built on my willingness to absorb discomfort so others would not have to. I realized that I had mistaken endurance for kindness and compliance for love. I did not take action right away. I did not pack my belongings or call a lawyer. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything did. I began keeping notes, writing down dates, decisions, small moments that confirmed my growing unease. I paid closer attention to what was said and what was avoided. Observation became my way of reclaiming control. By the end of that period, I understood something clearly. I had spoken, and I had been heard just enough to be silenced. In this house, truth was welcome only when it did not disrupt the comfort of others. That realization did not make me angry. It made me calm, and that calm carried a clarity I had not felt in years. I was still living in the same rooms, following the same routines, but I was no longer naive. I had crossed an invisible threshold. I knew now that if I wanted to protect myself, I could not rely on being understood. I would have to rely on being prepared. If you're still here and wondering how much someone can endure before something breaks, comment number 4 below. What happens next is the moment the truth reveals itself in a way that can't be ignored. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. The gathering was not meant to be a family occasion. It was one of those evenings Ethan hosted for people connected to his work, a mix of acquaintances and business contacts who came and went with polite smiles and practiced laughter. I prepared food as I always did, arranging trays, refilling glasses, making sure the house looked welcoming. No one asked if I wanted to join the conversation. My presence was functional, expected, and largely unnoticed. As the evening unfolded, I drifted between rooms, stepping in only when something needed attention. I watched from a distance as Ethan spoke confidently, as Lauren moved easily among the guests, presenting the house as if it were a shared accomplishment. I noticed how naturally she referred to it as our place, how no one questioned the phrasing. I told myself it did not matter. Words are flexible, I thought. Homes evolve. At some point, I stepped into the hallway to collect empty dishes. The door to the living room was partially closed, and voices carried more clearly than expected. I paused, not intending to listen, but what I heard stopped me in place. Lauren was speaking casually, comfortably, as if outlining plans already settled. She mentioned selling the house in the future, expanding the business, moving on. The tone was light, almost relieved. Then she said something that made the air around me feel suddenly thin. She referred to me as temporary, as someone who would not be part of that future. It was not said cruelly. That was what made it worse. It was said as fact, as if my removal from the picture required no explanation. I stood there, unseen, holding a stack of plates, while the final piece slid into place. I did not feel panic. I did not feel anger. What I felt was a sharp, quiet clarity. All the moments I had questioned myself came rushing back, aligning with a precision that left no room for doubt. The bedroom I had given up, the car I no longer drove, the financial documents I had been told not to worry about. None of it had been accidental. It had been preparation. I returned to the kitchen without making a sound. My hands moved automatically as I set the dishes down and wiped the counter. I looked around the room and saw it differently now. This was not a shared space. It was a resource being managed, leveraged, and eventually disposed of when no longer needed. And I was part of that calculation. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I smiled when required. I nodded when spoken to. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to interpret intentions or search for explanations that preserved my comfort. The truth had revealed itself without emotion or drama. That, more than anything, made it undeniable. I realized then that waiting for respect had been my greatest mistake. I had mistaken proximity for belonging and usefulness for love. The plan to sell the house was not just about property. It was about control. It was about removing the last piece of my independence under the guise of progress. I did not confront anyone that night. There would be no benefit in it. I understood now that reactions were expected, even anticipated. What they did not expect was a silence paired with intention. I finished cleaning, turned off the lights, and went to my room with a calm I had never known before. Lying in bed, I did not replay the conversation or imagine arguments. I focused instead on what needed to happen next. Awareness brings responsibility. I had seen the shape of what was coming, and I knew I could no longer pretend I was not standing directly in its path. That night marked the end of something I had clung to for years. It was the end of hoping to be included. In its place, something steadier took root. I understood the rules now, and with that understanding came the power to step out of the game entirely. After that evening, I stopped pretending that time would fix anything. The truth had settled too deeply for that. I did not wake up angry or desperate. What I felt instead was a steady, unsettling calm. The kind that comes when a question has already been answered and only action remains. For the first time in years, I understood that doing nothing was not neutrality. It was surrender. I spent several days mostly alone with my thoughts. I moved through the house quietly, completing familiar tasks while replaying the same realization again and again. If I stayed exactly where I was, the outcome was already written. I would lose the house, the last piece of independence I still had, and eventually even the illusion of belonging. If I left, I would be judged. I would be labeled selfish, dramatic, ungrateful. The world is rarely kind to women who stop sacrificing. I had to decide which loss I could live with. I thought about my life before all of this. I had worked for decades, balancing numbers, meeting deadlines, carrying responsibility without applause. I had raised a child, supported a marriage, and rebuilt myself after grief. I had always believed that endurance was a virtue, that if I gave enough, loved enough, stayed quiet enough, things would remain intact. Standing there, I finally allowed myself to see how little of that belief had protected me. The next step felt inevitable rather than dramatic. I made an appointment with a financial and property attorney, telling no one. I gathered documents I had kept organized for years, deeds, statements, records of accounts. Sitting in that office, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like someone finally asking the right questions. I wanted facts, not reassurance. The answers were clear. The house was mine, entirely and legally. My name was the only one on the deed. The loan connected to Ethan's business, the one that bore a signature resembling mine, raised immediate concern. The attorney did not need to dramatize it. The implications spoke for themselves. The law, I learned, was not confused about my rights, even if my family had been. I left that meeting without a sense of triumph. What I felt was relief. Knowledge stripped away the fog I had been living in. I no longer needed to guess where I stood. I had options, and that alone changed everything. I could pursue legal action. I could demand explanations. I could force a confrontation that would tear the household apart. But none of that appealed to me. I realized that the most powerful thing I could do was remove what they relied on without announcing it. I did not want revenge. I wanted separation. I wanted to reclaim control without turning my life into a battlefield. That decision shaped every step that followed. Quietly, methodically, I began preparing. I adjusted my personal accounts, ensuring access belonged to me alone. I reviewed and updated my will. I stopped handling business paperwork that did not legally concern me. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, I was dismantling a structure that had been built on my silence. This was not an impulsive escape. It was a deliberate withdrawal. I was choosing myself not out of anger, but out of necessity. I understood that once I took this step, there would be consequences. There always are when a woman stops making herself convenient. But I also knew something else. For the first time in a long while, I was acting in alignment with the truth. That alignment brought a sense of steadiness I had not felt before. I was no longer waiting to be included. I was preparing to leave a situation that required my disappearance in order to function. The choice I made that week did not come with relief or celebration. It came with resolve, and that resolve carried me forward, no longer guessing, no longer shrinking, but standing firmly in a decision I could not avoid any longer. If you're still watching and you feel the tension building toward an irreversible choice, comment number 6 below, because in Chapter 7, the absence speaks louder than any argument ever could. Let's continue. I did not announce my withdrawal. I did not explain myself or warn anyone. I simply stopped. The change was quiet, almost invisible at first. The kind of absence that only becomes obvious when something fails to happen. I stopped reviewing paperwork. I stopped tracking deadlines. I stopped stepping in when confusion appeared. I continued living in the house, moving through the rooms, cooking my meals, keeping to myself. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, everything was. The first signs appeared within days. Mail began to pile up on the counter. Envelopes I would have opened immediately sat untouched. A bill arrived twice, then a third time. The printer ran out of ink and stayed that way. Small inconveniences turned into irritations, and irritation slowly hardened into tension. I noticed the way Lauren's voice sharpened in the evenings, the way Ethan paced when he thought no one was watching. At first, they assumed it was temporary, a mood, a phase. They had grown used to my consistency, my quiet corrections, the way problems seemed to resolve themselves without effort. When that stopped, the house began to feel unbalanced. Schedules overlapped. Appointments were missed. A payment went through late, triggering a call that could not be ignored. I watched all of it from a careful distance. Lauren began to express her frustration openly. She spoke about pressure and responsibility, about feeling overwhelmed. The tone was not directed at me, but I felt its weight anyway. The assumption was clear. Something was not being handled, and that something had always been my domain. She did not ask for help. She complained about its absence. Ethan, on the other hand, grew quieter. I noticed him staying up later, sorting through the papers with an unfamiliar stiffness. He looked tired in a way that went beyond long hours. Once, I saw him rereading an email with the same expression I had worn weeks earlier, that look of delayed understanding. He did not come to me with questions. He seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel vindicated. I felt calm. Watching the consequences unfold confirmed what I had already accepted. The stability of that household had depended on my invisible labor, not because I was exceptional, but because I had been willing. When that willingness disappeared, the structure weakened. The atmosphere in the house shifted. Meals became irregular. The ease with which decisions had once been made vanished. Tension settled into the walls, replacing the quiet efficiency I had once maintained. I moved through it without interference, reminding myself daily that I was not causing this. I was simply no longer preventing it. There were moments when instinct urged me to step back in, to smooth things over, to restore order. Years of habit do not dissolve easily, but I resisted. I had learned that fixing everything only postponed the reckoning. This discomfort was necessary. It belonged to them. One evening, as I passed through the living room, I caught a glimpse of Ethan staring at a spread of documents. His shoulders slumped. For the first time, I saw him not as my child or my responsibility, but as an adult facing the weight of choices he had not wanted to examine. I felt a flicker of sadness, followed by resolve. Growth often begins with loss. By the end of that week, the truth was unmistakable. My presence had been the glue holding their system together. Without it, cracks appeared quickly and without mercy. I did not celebrate that realization. I accepted it. Acceptance gave me permission to move forward without guilt. I understood then that the consequences unfolding around me were not punishment. They were exposure. And once something is exposed, it cannot be unseen. I was ready for the next step, not out of anger, but because staying any longer would only delay what needed to happen. Once the consequences of my withdrawal became visible, doubt no longer had a place in my thoughts. I did not need further proof. What I had seen was enough to confirm what I already knew in my bones. I had been taken for granted, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. And habits, once comfortable, rarely change unless something forces them to. I stopped thinking about how to fix what was happening in the house and began thinking about where I would go next. For the first time in years, my plans did not revolve around anyone else's needs. I took out a notebook and began listing practical considerations: income, expenses, timelines. I calculated what I could afford on my own and realized that independence was not a distant fantasy. It was within reach. One afternoon, I reached out to an old friend named Helen, someone I had known long before my life narrowed to this house. She had moved to another state years ago and had rebuilt herself after a difficult divorce. The conversation was calm and grounded, free of pity or urgency. She listened, offered perspective, and reminded me that starting over later in life was not only possible, it was often clarifying. Speaking with her felt like breathing clean air. I knew I did not want to leave in chaos. I did not want slammed doors or dramatic exits. I wanted order. Leaving on my terms mattered more than speed. I gathered my personal documents slowly, deliberately: birth certificate, identification, financial records. I made copies and stored them safely. I opened a new bank account under my name alone and redirected what was mine to where it could not be questioned. At the same time, I began withdrawing emotionally. I did not insert myself into the growing tension between Ethan and Lauren. When disagreements surfaced, I remained neutral, distant. I stopped absorbing the stress that did not belong to me. Silence became a boundary rather than a habit. There was a moment one morning when I caught my reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized the woman looking back. She stood straighter. Her eyes were clearer. The exhaustion that had once settled into her face had softened. I realized then how deeply the environment I had been living in had shaped me. Stepping back had allowed something essential to return. I did not inform anyone of my plans right away. I waited until arrangements were in place, until uncertainty had been replaced with structure. I had learned that announcing intention too early invites interference. This decision was not a negotiation, it was a conclusion. As the days passed, I felt less like I was escaping and more like I was moving toward something. I imagined a space that was mine alone, where silence was peaceful instead of heavy, where my time belonged to me. The thought did not frighten me. It steadied me. There were moments of sadness, of course. Letting go always carries a quiet grief. But that grief was cleaner than the slow erosion I had been enduring. I reminded myself that choosing a different path did not erase love. It simply redefined responsibility. By the end of that week, I knew exactly what I would say when the time came. I would not ask permission. I would not justify myself. I would state the truth calmly and without apology. I was leaving because staying had required me to disappear. The path ahead was not entirely mapped out, but it was unmistakably mine. For the first time in a long while, that knowledge felt like enough. If you're still here and ready to see how everything finally comes together, comment number 8 below. What comes next is the conclusion they never expected, and it changes the meaning of everything you've heard so far. Let's move on to the final chapters. The morning I left looked ordinary from the outside. The sky was pale and clear, the kind of day that gives no indication it will matter later. Inside the house, everything was quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. I had already packed what I needed. There was no rush, no panic, only the steady awareness that this was the moment I had prepared for. I did not make breakfast for anyone. I did not straighten shared spaces or check calendars. I moved through the rooms once, slowly, not out of nostalgia, but out of closure. I took note of how little still belonged to me. That realization no longer hurt. It simply confirmed the choice I was making. When Ethan came downstairs, I told him I was leaving. I did not ask me to talk. I did not sit down. I stated it plainly, as a fact rather than a discussion. He looked confused, as if he had misheard me, as if the idea did not fit into the structure of his expectations. I could see him searching for the right response, the one that would restore things to normal. Lauren appeared moments later, drawn by the shift in tone. Her reaction was sharper, more defensive, as though my departure were an accusation. I did not argue. I did not explain my reasoning again. I had already explained it to myself, and that was enough. I told them where I would be reachable and that I was safe. Nothing more. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. There was no dramatic pause, no final speech. I did not look back at the living room or the kitchen. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me with a calm that surprised even me. It felt less like leaving and more like setting something down. The drive away from the house was quiet. Traffic moved normally. People went about their day unaware that anything significant had happened. That anonymity felt comforting. Not every ending needs an audience. In the small apartment I had arranged ahead of time, the silence greeted me gently. There were no expectations waiting in the corners, no lists to manage, no tension in the air. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, taking in the stillness. For the first time in a long while, nothing was required of me. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel broken. What I felt was space to think, to rest, to exist without being useful. That space settled around me like something I had been missing without knowing its name. Later, I imagined the house I had left behind filling with the consequences of my absence. I did not picture chaos or regret. I pictured adjustment, growth, if they allowed it. That was no longer my responsibility. That day marked the end of a chapter I had outgrown, not because it was painful, but because it no longer fit. I understood then that choosing myself did not mean abandoning others. It meant refusing to abandon myself any longer. Time did not rush to meet me after I left. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if giving me space to catch my breath. In my new life, there were no emergencies waiting in the morning, no expectations disguised as love. Days had shape, but they were mine. In that quiet, I began to understand what had really happened to me. I looked back on the years I had spent trying to be everything for everyone. I saw how easily care had turned into obligation, how generosity had been mistaken for availability. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. It took losing myself to see how false that idea was. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is convenience. The change in me was subtle, but profound. I no longer felt the constant guilt that once followed every decision. I stopped explaining myself, even in my own head. I learned to pause and ask what I wanted, not what would make things easier for others. That question, once unfamiliar, became natural. My relationship with Ethan did not end, but it changed. We spoke less often, and when we did, our conversations were careful, honest, and bounded. I did not return to my old role. I did not step back into silence. Distance, I learned, can be an act of respect when closeness has become harmful. What surprised me most was how peace settled in once I stopped fighting myself. I did not need a dramatic victory or an apology to feel whole. I needed alignment. I needed to live in a way that did not require constant compromise of my dignity. Being a mother had been the central identity of my life for decades. Letting go of the idea that motherhood meant endless sacrifice was painful, but freeing. Loving your child does not mean erasing yourself. Teaching them to respect you may be the final lesson you give. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this: You do not need permission to protect your sense of self. It is never too late to step away from what diminishes you. Sometimes the bravest, most loving choice is to leave, not in anger, but in clarity. And in that clarity, you find yourself again. Sometimes the most powerful ending is not loud or dramatic, but quiet and resolute. This story is not about leaving a place, but about returning to oneself. It is about recognizing the moment when love turns into obligation, when sacrifice becomes erasure, and when silence starts to cost more than speaking up. Life has a way of teaching us that dignity is not something others give us. It is something we choose to protect. Walking away is not always a failure. Sometimes it is the clearest form of self-respect. When we stop setting ourselves on fire to keep others warm, we discover that our own light is enough. And from that place, peace is not earned through endurance, but through honesty with ourselves. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it resonated with you or reminded you of something you have lived or witnessed, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more stories that speak to real lives and real turning points.